Hey everybody, and welcome to Database Camp. My name is Sarah, and in today's video I wanted to talk about a particular book. It's called Racism in America. It's a free ebook that the Harvard Press is actually allowing people to download in the PDF form. I'm going to post the link below, so hopefully you'll download it and read it for yourself. But if you're one who isn't that big into reading, or maybe doesn't necessarily like reading those types of books, I want to be able to read these books aloud on my YouTube channel. Because the book is more of like an anthology, I will be able to break it up into each of the chapters or each of the excerpts. So each video will contain one of the excerpts in this book. A lot of people don't really get too political here on YouTube for obvious reasons. They don't want to lose monetization and stuff like that. There's a lot of people, a lot of reasons why people may not want to talk about this issue. I came across an Instagram post, and it said something to the effect of, what will you tell your children when they ask you about the Black Lives Matter movement and what you did to help or advocate and stuff, like something along those lines, like what were your contributions essentially to helping with Black Lives Matter, that sort of thing. And it just made me think, really, because for one, I'm not in the position to donate any money to organizations that help in that, because I don't have the resources like that. And as far as the protests go, there's reasons why someone wouldn't want to go out to the protests, and so, you know, we can't really hold that against people either. And so I feel like the only thing that I can really do is educate myself and try to at least help educate others. And so with reading this book aloud on my YouTube channel, I hope that people will find out, for one, at least find out about the book. And if, you know, they're interested, and hopefully you guys are interested in just listening to me read the book out loud to you. That's one of the things that I feel like I can do. So I'm just going to read very quickly the foreword, written by Annette Gordon-Reed, and so I'm going to start with that. The United States is apparently living through one of those punctuation points in history that, seemingly out of the blue, arrived to spur societal change. After years of complaints about the over-policing of Black communities and police violence against African Americans, including a number of high-profile killings of unarmed men, women, and children, the country erupted into protests when a police officer killed George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in May 2020. The event, captured on video, was seen by millions around the world. As if a dam had broken, thousands of people participated in demonstrations in each of the 50 states, coming out in force to voice solidarity with Floyd and the movement Black Lives Matter. Formed in 2013, after the acquittal of the vigilante who killed Trayvon Martin, the outrage spread across borders and oceans. People in countries the world over came out in large numbers to voice their anger about what had happened, and to connect the event to racially based problems in their own countries. Although George Floyd's death was the spark, there was also an instantaneous recognition that the circumstances giving rise to what happened to him that day were systemic, the product of many years of thoughts, choices, and actions. People also understood that history has mattered greatly to this process, particularly the tortured history of race and white supremacy, not just a matter of white and black, but of white people and people of color generally. That has been in the place for centuries. Current policies shaped by that history must be subjected to scrutiny and critiqued. Plans for the future, based upon new understandings about how to achieve a more racially just society, must also be formulated. The excerpts in this anthology, a mix of history, cultural commentary, economics, political science, and biography, address these and other points salient to helping the country form that more perfect union to which the Constitution of the United States refers, and to which we aspire. This is not only important for Americans, it is important for the world. As the global nature of the Floyd-inspired protests reveals, the authors persuasively show that the worldwide system of slavery, the ambition for empire that disrupted the lives of indigenous people on several continents, and the powerful legacies from those events have fueled this movement and the current desire for a reckoning. It is more than fitting to have a collection that invites readers to dig deep into these matters as the world ponders next steps. This is the beginning to racism in America. Playing in the Dark, Whiteness, and the Literary Imagination. Toni Morrison writes, just a little summary on who Toni Morrison is. Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Toni Morrison brings the genius of a virtuosic writer to this personal inquiry into the significance of African Americans in the American literary imagination. She ponders the effect that living in a historically racialized society has had on American writing and argues that central characters of American literature, including individualism, masculinity, and a juxtaposition of innocence with images of death and hell, are responses to a dark, abiding Africanist presence. In this excerpt, Morrison examines the ways in which literary discourse and criticism have evaded and ignored this Africanist presence in American literature. For some time now, I have been thinking about the validity or vulnerability of a certain set of assumptions conventionally accepted among literary historians and critics, and circulated as knowledge. This knowledge holds that traditional, canonical American literature is free of, uninformed, and unshaped by the 400-year-old presence of, first, Africans and then African Americans in the United States. It assumes that this presence, which shaped the body politic, the Constitution, and the entire history of the culture, has had no significant place or consequence in origin and development of that culture's literature. Moreover, such knowledge assumes that the characteristics of our national literature emanate from a particular Americanness that is separate from and unaccountable to this presence. There seems to be a more or less tacit agreement among literary scholars that because American literature has been clearly the preserve of white male views, genius and power, those views, genius and power are without relationship to and removed from the overwhelming presence of black people in the United States. This agreement is made about a population that preceded every American writer of renown and was, I have come to believe, one of the most fortuitously radical, impinging forces on the country's literature. The contemplation of this black presence is central to any understanding of our national literature and should not be permitted to hover at the margins of literary imagination. These speculations have led me to wonder whether the major and champion characteristics of our national literature, individualism, masculinity, social engagement versus historical isolation, acute and ambiguous moral problematics, the thematics of innocence coupled with an obsession with figurations of death and hell, are not in fact responses to a dark, abiding, signing Africanist presence. It has occurred to me that the very manner by which American literature distinguishes itself as a coherent entity exists because of this unsettled and unsettling population. Just as the formation of the nation necessitated coded language and purposeful restriction to deal with the racial disingenuousness and moral frailty at its heart, so too did the literature, whose founding characteristics extend into the 20th century, reproduce the necessity for codes and restriction. Through significant and underscored omissions, startling contradictions, heavily nuanced conflicts through the way writers peopled their work with the signs and bodies of this presence, one can see that a real or fabricated Africanist presence was crucial to their sense of Americanness, and it shows. My curiosity about the origins and literary uses of this carefully observed and carefully invented Africanist presence has become an informal study of what I call American Africanism. It is an investigation into the ways in which a non-white African-like or Africanist presence or persona was constructed in the United States and the imaginative uses this fabricated presence served. I am using the term Africanism not to suggest the larger body of knowledge on Africa that the philosopher Valentin Mudimbe, sorry if I said that wrong, means by the term Africanism, nor to suggest the varieties and complexities of African people and their descendants who have inhabited this country. Rather, I use it as a term for the denotative and connotative blackness that African peoples have come to signify, as well as the entire range of views, assumptions, readings, and misreadings that accompany Eurocentric learning about these people. As a trope, little restraint has been attached to its uses. As a disabling virus within literary discourse, Africanism has become, in the Eurocentric tradition that American education favors, both a way of talking about and a way of policing matters of class, sexual license and repression, formations and exercises of power, and meditations on ethics and accountability. Through the simple expedient of demonizing and reifying the range of color on a palette, American Africanism makes it possible to say and not say, to inscribe and erase, to escape and engage, to act out and act on, to historicize and render timeless. It provides a way of contemplating chaos and civilization, desire and fear, and a mechanism for testing the problems and blessings of freedom. The United States, of course, is not unique in the construction of Africanism. South America, England, France, Germany, Spain, the cultures of all these countries have participated and contributed to some aspect of an invented Africa. None has been able to persuade itself for long that criteria and knowledge could emerge outside the categories of domination. Among Europeans and the Europeanized, this shared process of exclusion, of assigned designation and value, has led to the popular and academic notion that racism is a natural, if irritating, phenomena. The literature of almost all these countries, however, is now subject to sustained critiques of its racialized discourse. The United States is a curious exception, even though it stands out as being the oldest democracy in which a black population accompanied, if one can use that word, and in many cases preceded the white settlers. Here in the nexus, with its particular formulations and in the absence of real knowledge or open-minded inquiry about Africans and African Americans, under the pressures of ideological and imperialistic rationales for subjugation, an American brand of Africanism emerged, strongly urged, thoroughly serviceable, companionably ego-reinforcing and pervasive, for excellent reasons of state, because European sources of cultural hegemony were dispersed but not yet valorized in the new country. The process of organizing American coherence through a distancing Africanism became the operative mode of a new cultural hegemony. These remarks should not be interpreted as simply an effort to move the gaze of African American studies to a different site. I do not want to alter one hierarchy in order to institute another. It is true that I do not want to encourage those totalizing approaches to African American scholarship which have no drive other than the exchange of dominations, dominant Eurocentric scholarship replaced by dominant Afrocentric scholarship. More interesting is what makes intellectual domination possible, how knowledge is transformed from invasion and conquest to revelation and choice, what ignites and informs the literary imagination, and what forces help establish the parameters of criticism. Above all, I am interested in how agendas in criticism have disguised themselves and, in so doing, impoverished the literature it studies. Criticism as a form of knowledge is capable of robbing literature not only of its own implicit and explicit ideology, but of its ideas as well. It can dismiss the difficult, arduous work writers do to make an art that becomes and remains part of and significant within a human landscape. It is important to see how inextricable Africanism is, or ought to be, from the deliberations of literary criticism and the wanton, elaborate strategies undertaken to erase its presence from view. What Africanism became for, and how it functioned in, the literary imagination is of paramount interest because it may be possible to discover, through a close look at literary blackness, the nature, even the cause, of literary whiteness. What is it for? What parts do the invention and development of whiteness play in the construction of what is loosely described as American? If such an inquiry ever comes to maturity, it may provide access to a deeper reading of American literature, a reading not completely available now, not least, I suspect, because of the studied indifference of most literary criticism to these matters. One likely reason for the paucity of critical material on this large and compelling subject is that, in matters of race, silence and evasion have historically ruled literary discourse. Evasion has fostered another substitute language in which the issues are encoded, foreclosing open debate. The situation is aggravated by the tremor that breaks into discourse on race. It is further complicated by the fact that the habit of ignoring race is understood to be a graceful, even generous, liberal gesture. To notice is to recognize an already discredited difference. To enforce its invisibility through silence is to allow the black body a shadowless participation in the dominant cultural body. According to this logic, every well-bred instinct argues against noticing and forecloses adult discourse. It is just this concept of literary and scholarly moyers which functions smoothly in literary criticism, but neither makes nor receives credible claims in other disciplines, that has terminated the shelf life of some once extremely well-regarded American authors and blocked access to remarkable insights in their works. These moyers are delicate things, however, which must be given some thought before they are abandoned. Not observing such niceties can lead to startling displays of scholarly lapses in objectivity. In 1936, an American scholar investigating the use of Negro so-called dialect in the works of Edgar Allan Poe, a short article clearly proud of its racial equanimity, opens this way. Despite the fact that he grew up largely in the South and spent some of his most fruitful years in Richmond and Baltimore, Poe has little to say about the darky. Although I know this sentence represents the polite parlance of the day, that darky was understood to be a term more acceptable than the N-word. The grimace I made upon reading it was followed by an alarmed distrust of the scholar's abilities. If it seems unfair to reach back to the 30s for samples of the kind of lapse that can occur when certain manners of polite repression are waived, let me assure you equally egregious representations of the phenomena are still common. Another reason for this quite ornamental vacuum in literary discourse on the presence and influence of Africanist peoples in American criticism is the pattern of thinking about racialism in terms of its consequences on the victim, of always defining it asymmetrically from the perspective of its impact on the object of racist policy and attitudes. A good deal of time and intelligence has been invested in the exposure of racism and the horrific results on its objects. There are constant, if erratic, liberalizing efforts to legislate these matters. There are also powerful and persuasive attempts to analyze the origin and fabrication of racism itself, contesting the assumption that it is an inevitable, permanent, and eternal part of all social landscapes. I do not wish to disparage these inquiries. It is precisely because of them that any progress at all has been accomplished in matters of racial discourse. But that well-established study should be joined with another, equally important one: the impact of racism on those who perpetuate it. It seems both poignant and striking how avoided and unanalyzed is the effect of racist inflection on the subject. What I propose here is to examine the impact of notions of racial hierarchy, racial exclusion, and racial vulnerability and availability on non-blacks who held, resisted, explored, or altered those notions. The scholarship that looks into the mind, imagination, and behavior of slaves is valuable. But equally valuable is a serious intellectual effort to see what racial ideology does to the mind, imagination, and behavior of masters. Historians have approached these areas as have social scientists, anthropologists, psychiatrists, and some students of comparative literature. Literary scholars have begun to pose these questions of various national literatures. Urgently needed is the same kind of attention paid to the literature of the Western country that has one of the most resilient Africanist populations in the world, a population that has always had a curiously intimate and unhingingly separate existence within the dominant one. When matters of race are located and called attention to in American literature, critical response has tended to be on the order of a humanistic nostrum or a dismissal mandated by the label political. Excising the political from the life of the mind is a sacrifice that has proven costly. I think of this erasure as a kind of trembling hypochondria always curing itself with unnecessary surgery. A criticism that needs to insist that literature is not only universal, but also race-free, risks lobotomizing that literature and diminishes both the art and the artist. I am vulnerable to the inference here that my inquiry has vested interests, that because I am an African American and a writer, I stand to benefit in ways not limited to intellectual fulfillment from this line of questioning. I will have to risk the accusation because the point is too important. For both black and white American writers in a wholly racialized society, there is no escape from racially inflected language, and the work writers do to unhobble the imagination from the demands of that language is complicated, interesting, and definitive. Like thousands of avid but non-academic readers, some powerful literary critics in the United States have never read, and are proud to say so, any African American text. It seems to have done them no harm, presenting them with no discernible limitations in the scope of their work or influence. I suspect, with much evidence to support the suspicion, that they will continue to flourish without any knowledge whatsoever of African American literature. What is fascinating, however, is to observe how their lavish exploration of literature manages not to see meaning in the thunderous, theatrical presence of black surrogacy, an informing, stabilizing, and disturbing element in the literature they do study. It is interesting, not surprising, that the arbiters of critical power in American literature seem to take pleasure in, indeed relish, their ignorance of African American texts. What is surprising is that their refusal to read black texts, a refusal that makes no disturbance in their intellectual life, repeats itself when they reread the traditional, established works of literature worthy of their attention. It is possible, for example, to read Henry James' scholarship exhaustively and never arrive at a nodding mention, much less a satisfactory treatment, of the black woman who lubricates the turn of the plot and becomes the agency of moral choice and meaning in what Maisie knew. Never are we invited to a reading of The Beast in the Jungle, in which the figuration is followed to what seems to me its logical conclusion. It is hard to think of any aspect of Gertrude Stein's 3 lives that has not been covered except the exploratory and explanatory uses to which she puts the black woman who holds center stage in that work. The urgency and anxiety in Willa Cather's rendering of black characters are liable to be missed entirely. No mention is made of the problem that race causes in the technique and the credibility of her last novel, Sapphira and the Slave Girl. These critics see no excitement or meaning in the tropes of darkness, sexuality, and desire in Ernest Hemingway or in his cast of black men. They see no connection between God's grace and Africanist othering in Flannery O'Connor. With few exceptions, Faulkner criticism collapses the major themes of that writer into discursive mythologies and treats the later works, whose focus is race and class, as minor, superficial, marked by decline. An instructive parallel to this willed scholarly indifference is the centuries-long hysterical blindness to feminist discourse and the way in which women and women's issues were read or unread. Blatant sexist readings are on the decline, and where they still exist they have little effect because of the successful appropriation by women of their own discourse. National literatures, like writers, get along the best they can and with what they can, yet they do seem to end up describing and inscribing what is really on the national mind. For the most part, the literature of the United States has taken as its concern the architecture of a new white man. If I am disenchanted by the indifference of literary criticism toward examining the range of that concern, I do have a lasting resort: the writers themselves. Writers are among the most sensitive, the most intellectually anarchic, most representative, most probing of artists. The ability of writers to imagine what is not the self, to familiarize the strange and mystify the familiar, is the test of their power. The languages they use and the social and historical context in which these languages signify are indirect and direct revelations of that power and its limitations. So it is to them, the creators of American literature, that I look for clarification about the invention and effect of Africanism in the United States. My early assumptions as a reader were that black people signified little or nothing in the imagination of white American writers, other than as the objects of an occasional bout of jungle fever, other than to provide local color or to lend some touch of verisimilitude or to supply a needed moral gesture, humor, or bit of pathos. Black made no appearance at all. This was a reflection, I thought, of the marginal impact that blacks had on the lives of the characters in the work as well as the creative imagination of the author. To imagine or write otherwise, to situate black people throughout the pages and scenes of a book like some government quota would be ludicrous and dishonest. But then I stopped reading as a reader and began to read as a writer. Living in a racially articulated and predicated world, I could not be alone in reacting to this aspect of the American cultural and historical condition. I began to see how the literature I revered, the literature I loathed, behaved in its encounter with racial ideology. American literature could not help being shaped by that encounter. Yes, I wanted to identify those moments when American literature was complicit in the fabrication of racism, but equally important, I wanted to see when literature exploded and undermined it. Still, those were minor concerns. Much more important was to contemplate how Africanist personae, narrative, and idiom moved and enriched the text in self-conscious ways, to consider what the engagement meant for the work of the writer's imagination. How does literary utterance arrange itself when it tries to imagine an Africanist other? What are the signs, the codes, the literary strategies designed to accommodate this encounter? What does the inclusion of Africans or African Americans do to and for the work? As a reader, my assumption had always been that nothing happens. Africans and their descendants were not, in any sense that matters, there. And when they were there, they were decorative displays of the agile writer's technical expertise. I assumed that since the author was not black, the appearance of Africanist characters or narrative or idiom in a work could never be about anything other than the normal, unracialized, illusory white world that provided the fictional backdrop. Certainly, no American text of the sort I am discussing was ever written for black people, no more than Uncle Tom's Cabin was written for Uncle Tom to read or be persuaded by. As a writer reading, I came to realize the obvious. The subject of the dream is the dreamer. The fabrication of an Africanist persona is reflexive, an extraordinary meditation on the self, a powerful exploration of the fears and desires that reside in the writerly conscious. It is an astonishing revelation of longing, of terror, of perplexity, of shame, of magnanimity. It requires hard work not to see this. It is as if I had been looking at a fishbowl. The glide and flick of the golden scales, the green tip, the bolt of white careening back from the gills, the castles at the bottom surrounded by pebbles and tiny intricate fronds of green, the barely distributed water, the flecks of waste and food, the tranquil bubbles traveling to the surface, and suddenly I saw the bowl, the structure that transparently and invisibly permits the ordered life it contains to exist in the larger world. In other words, I began to rely on my knowledge about how books get written, how language arrives, my sense of how and why writers abandon or take on certain aspects of their project. I began to rely on my understanding of what the linguistic struggle requires of writers and what they make of the surprise that is the inevitable concomitant of the act of creation. What became transparent were the self-evident ways that Americans choose to talk about themselves through and within a sometimes allegorical, sometimes metaphorical, but always choked representation of an Africanist presence. That was the end of the first excerpt, entitled Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination by Toni Morrison. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative. So please make sure to leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below, and tell me if you clicked on that link and chose to download the free ebook. I would love to know that too. So we'll be seeing each other in the next video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment, all that good stuff. Alright, see you guys later. Bye guys.